We're joined by Assad AbuKhalil from Modesto, California. Assad, can you hear us?
I can hear you very well, in fact, yes.
Thank you. So welcome to this second episode of CN Live. We apologize we weren't able to have you on last week.
That's okay.
But we have you here now. We've just been talking mostly about WikiLeaks, an interview with Kristen Hafkinson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. But we're going to turn to a completely different direction now, the Middle East. It's one of the things we want to continuously cover here on CN Live. So we're really pleased you're here. Assad is a professor of political science at California State University. He's Lebanese in origin. He is a leftist. I don't think he'd be ashamed of me saying that. Coming out of the great tradition of secular leftists in the Arab countries. So Assad has also contributed to Consortium News. Assad, I want to talk to you about Syria. I don't think there's been anywhere near the coverage of the Syrian war in the Western media as there was over the first 6 years, really. And you did a great job criticizing the Western media's coverage of that war. So I wanted to ask you about why, first of all, you think we're not hearing much about it anymore. Could it be that Assad is winning, Bashar al-Assad, and Russia and Iran and Hezbollah are basically winning? And then I want to ask you about the Battle of Idlib province. I remember when Aleppo was liberated, when other areas held by jihadists were liberated, they put jihadists, they being the Syrian Arab Army, Syrian government, put these jihadists on buses and their families, and they sent them to Idlib province. And right then and there, you knew at some point there would be a huge battle, the last battle in Idlib. They seem to be concentrating them in Idlib. So please give us your assessment of the Western media coverage recently of Syria, and what do you think the Idlib situation is in terms of whether this is the last battle and how it's going?
Right. First, I want to say that there is a deliberate disregard for the story about WikiLeaks in Arab media, most of which are under the control of the Saudi royal family. The Saudi royal family have been so embarrassed and humiliated by some of the leaks that they are more than happy to gloat over the plight of the founder. On the subject of Syria, I think you're right. There is not as much as coverage of the situation. And all those Western journalists who hypocritically and disingenuously shed all these crocodile tears over the plight of the Syrian people, they are nowhere to be seen. Just because the US government has not as publicly invested in the story as they did in the past. I am more critical of the Syrian government than you sound, Joe, but I will say the following. The Syrian government is, on the one hand, intent on extending its authority all over Syrian territory and resuming the oppressive rule that it had for all these decades. And it seems the Syrian government, the Syrian regime hasn't learned from the lessons of the past, because they still censor TV shows, they still censor writings and so on. So they keep doing that role that they've always done. And on the other hand, the Turkish government, at the behest of the United States, I think partly, is not allowing the Syrian government to take over Idlib. So there is a tug of war going on. And despite what the Russian calculations are, and I'm not sure what they are, because they seem to play a double game. On the one hand, they are supportive of the Syrian government and its allies, which include Hezbollah. But on the other hand, they work very closely with the Israelis, allowing Israel the freedom to bomb and to violate Syrian territory and Lebanese territory in the course of bombing Syria as well. I think that the United States and the Western countries do not want the Syrian carnage to end. Let us remember that Western governments have a very long record of prolonging the suffering of people who are going through civil wars or wars between two countries. Western countries are behind the prolongation of the Iran-Iraq war for over 8 years, killing over 1 million people. They were also behind the prolongation of the Lebanese civil war from 1975 until 1990. And I think they are doing the same game here in Syria. They are more than happy to watch their enemies, the enemies of Israel as well as the enemy of the United States, being distracted and being diverted into this war. And they also don't want either side to win. And that's what's happening. The Turkish government is now investing heavily in the situation. I also noticed 2 days ago, for the first time, the Gulf media, Saudi media in particular, have been celebrating a new development, which is the CIA, despite absence of any reference to that in American media, has resumed training for the so-called Free Syrian Army, as if their past record of fighting in Syria has been any successful in the past, as if it's going to make any difference now. But that tells me that the United States is intent on keeping the status quo as it is. They don't want the Syrian refugees to return. They want them to stay in the host countries, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, because they want to use them as a bargaining chip. Because in the same time where the fighting is going on, there is the international envoy on Syria, Anderson, who is negotiating a constitutional arrangement. And up to this point, there is no progress in that regard. The gap between the two sides is very wide. And the Saudi government is controlling entirely the Syrian negotiating team, the leader of which is somebody I knew in my graduate school days at Georgetown. And he was one of the most vulgar, vociferous propagandists for the Syrian government. And now he speaks on behalf of a new revolutionary Syria. I mean, it tells you about the farce of the Syrian opposition exile that we refer to. So the Saudis control them. And of course, the Americans control the Saudis. So America is as detached as Trump seemed to be from Syria, is intent on keeping things as they are without allowing any progress for the Syrian government to extend its control throughout the territory.
So let me ask you. I want to ask you about what you said about the double game that Russia's playing. But before that, you mentioned about my position about Syria. It was interesting because I was reading you very closely on your blog, Angry Arab, and I agreed with your position at the beginning of this war that pox on both houses. Didn't like Assad, didn't like any of the opposition.
Right.
But when the jihadists began to grow in number and support from the Gulf countries, from Turkey, when ISIS developed and took over real territory there, and Al-Qaeda became a force, I suddenly thought, well, we had to choose between the greater two evils, either Assad or the jihadists. Who would you rather have? Now, Assad never, despite all of his rubbish over 40 years, including his father, anti-Israel rhetoric, never posed a real threat to Israel.
Right.
And certainly did not pose a threat to Europe, whereas the jihadists, Islamic State, took credit for these attacks in Belgium and Germany, and certainly the horrible thing in Paris, in California. So they were a threat to the West, whoever was behind those attacks.
Right.
So I came to the conclusion that we had to hope for an Arab government victory, Syrian Arab army victory, as much as I dislike the regime of Assad. So what is your position today? Is there an alternative to a secular, corrupt government in Damascus of Assad, or jihadists?
Well, I mean, I have this argument, to be honest with you, with leftists in the Arab world regularly. And this is a legitimate question to have. But you prefaced your introduction to me by referring to my leftist background and present, of course. I mean, I came of age when I was 15 and 16 when the Lebanese civil war first broke out. And in the beginning, it was a secular fight between left-wing group and the Palestinian resistance movement against the phalangists and the right-wing coalition that were supported by Israel and the United States. And it was a glorious fight the first 2 years. And there was a potential for a real revolution. I mean, that's how I referred to it at the time, and that's how we did. And then in 1976, Syrian regime was assigned a sinister role by the United States and by Israel. And there's declassified US document to point all this out, in which the Syrian regime came to smash the revolutionary movement of the left in support of the right-wing coalition of the Phalange and the others and so on. So for me, I have still that bitter memory, not to mention the record of the Syrian regime inside against various groups. Plus, I mean, what is the alternative? I choose neither of these situations, by the way. In particular, there was an alternative. There was, throughout the years, and I've known many of them, a vibrant left-wing communist movement inside Syria. And I'm not talking about these puppet communists that were controlled by the government and put in a charade as part of the regime and so on. I'm talking about real leftists who really suffered. People like Communist Action Organization, who were the most brave, courageous dissident inside Syria. And they were rounded up throughout the years by the Syrian government to this very day. The Syrian government prevented the real alternative that you and I would like, which is the left-wing secular groups and so on. So at this point, I think we are left with a situation where the alternative are in prisons or they are dead. And we are watching a fight between one side, the Syrian government and its allies, and the jihadis, who basically now are fighting on behalf, not even of jihad, on behalf of the Gulf regime, of the Western governments and so on. It's a very untawdry coalition. I mean, the fight has become very much like that one in Afghanistan. Although in Afghanistan, I was very clear, I still am, categorically on the side of the Soviet army against all these fanatical groups that we are suffering from today. And of course, the United States and Saudi Arabia, the same group of today, they were on the side of bin Laden. I mean, look how history plays itself.
Well, look, you clearly, and people in the U.S. do not know that because the mainstream media never tells them that for a long time, the United States and Britain have allied themselves, supported religious groups, extremist groups in the region to overthrow secular socialist regimes, or in name, if anything, those who follow in the tradition of NASA to try to, who were standing up to U.S., Israeli, and European interests in the Middle East. Now, when the Cold War ended, they moved on their opportunity, I think, to take over these and overthrow these secular governments. Now, could there be a revival of secularism in the region if Assad wins? I mean, as bad as he is, could that spark a spark?
I do not see that at all. And I also do not compare the Assad regime or the Saddam regime to Nasser. I mean, Nasser had a very progressive secular project, which had reverberations throughout the region. I mean, Nasser really championed the very poor of people. He used to go to factories and he used to watch what workers ate. And one time he saw some of them eating onions and bread, and he was so astonished. And he had a change in public policy because he was so affected by the small nutritional intake by these workers. Nothing like that in the Ba'athist regime. And in particular, the current president of Syria, since he took over, has championed neoliberal policies. I mean, up to the war, he was on very good terms with the United States, with World Bank, with Western lending institution. There was a four-season hotel open. And this is an element of the underlying causes of the Syrian revolt. These were the displaced people from neoliberalism, the people who suffered, especially in rural areas, who left because of drought, came to the cities, and there were no jobs available to them. The ones who were benefiting were the rich elite, some of which were cronies of the regime themselves and relative of the president.
Yes, that Four Seasons hotel in Damascus, I went to. That was a place where Wall Streeters were going on holiday just before the war began, up right till the beginning. I didn't mean to imply in any way to compare Saddam or even Gaddafi, who they all claim to be inheritors of Nasser, as being anywhere like Nasser. But the argument I was trying to make was, what would an Assad victory mean in Syria to the explosion of extremist religious groups backed by the Gulf, the U.S.? That's what I really want to ask you.
To answer your question about secularism, I'm glad, it just struck me, you're asking about leftism and secularism, how rarely these issues are discussed and associated in the Middle East. This is an untold story in mainstream media, by the way, and I'm glad here we have a chance to talk about it. I think there is a chance for secularism, and there is a chance for rise of leftism and so on. People are, the thing is, the crimes of Gulf governments and the crimes of these fanatical religious groups, many of which are supported by the West over the decades, have become so widespread that people are disgusted not only with their ideologies, and some people are disgusted by religion in general. I feel there is, you can see that on social media where people have a chance to express themselves. People are fed up with religious movement and so on. And so there is a possibility of pushing the religious establishment, which is widely mocked in social media, away in the future. But unfortunately, it is resurrected by every regime. Even the Ba'ath regime of Syria, it wasn't that it was against the exploitation of religion for its own purposes. It wanted to exploit religion, but it's for its own end, not for the end of another government and so on. So it didn't push secularism as much. On the subject of what's going to come next, my worry is the Syrian government, if it achieves victory, it will harbor an illusion that it can resume to rule in the same manner it ruled in the past. And I say that because I see signs. Somebody was arrested because he wrote a comment on Facebook. And I'm thinking, there is a war going on. There is an international war going on. There are all these array of international forces led by the United States. And the regime had the time to worry about somebody writing a comment on Facebook. It just tells you that the regime hasn't changed its color in terms of repression.
The lousy Syrian regime, as you've often referred it to. And when you were speaking now, I was thinking about the missed opportunity maybe in Egypt after the overthrow of Mubarak, when the secular so-called democratic groups couldn't get their act together to win that election. They could not defeat the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, busing people in, etc. So I'm not too optimistic about Assad winning again and that creating a secular movement across the region. But I wanted to bring back to what you said about Russia's diplomacy. It's very interesting. I've wondered about that double game as well. When the Turkish shot down that Russian plane over what seemed to be Syrian airspace. I happened to be in Moscow that day, and then I could tell you one thing: Russian people didn't give a damn about it one way or the other that I spoke to, but it seemed like that how Putin would react to that would be telling in the long-term outplay of the war. And it seems like he was able to maneuver Erdogan onto his side and get him to back off the support of ISIS, at least in Turkey, but not the Kurds. I think that's the sticking point. Correct me if I'm wrong. And as far as his relations with Israel, I don't understand that myself. So could you help me to understand what he's trying to do with Israel?
No, I mean, Israel has the fortunate situation of having two big superpowers on its side. And I never trusted the Russian regime on the subject of Israel. I mean, I am somebody who never trusted the Soviet Union in the old days about the extent of its support for Arabs against Israel, because it was always pushing left-wing group, that the Popular Front and the Palestinian Resistance Movement, against radical solution to the Palestinian problem. I mean, in 1971, it forced George Habash of the Popular Front to expel his closest comrade, Wadi Haddad, because it wasn't interested in the international operation that Wadi Haddad was doing. So with Putin, I mean, Trump himself said that in the first meeting he had with Putin, that Putin was going on expressing rave admiration for Netanyahu. And also I want to point out about the Russian people, what you said, that they didn't care. Public opinion surveys in Russia shows that there is the least support for Palestinians in Russia than there is for most countries of Europe or elsewhere. Support for Israel in Russia. And I think also you probably are aware, I mean, there is quite a bit of Islamophobia in Russia as well. Not as much as it exists in France and say Austria and so on, but it exists nevertheless. I think that the Russian government wants to achieve a foothold, wants to teach the US a lesson in Syria, but it doesn't go to the extent of in any way harming Israeli ability to control the region and to impose its will. But thus far, I think the Iranian remains steadfast against pressure by the Russians to get out of Syria. And Hassan Nasrallah, in an interview he gave last Friday, was very clear that we have very good relations with the Russian government, but we have strong disagreements with them about what's happening in Syria, especially on the ability of Israel to mount all these strikes.
One shouldn't forget that Stalin and the Soviet Union voted in 1948 for the resolution creating Israel. They supported Israel right from the beginning. Elizabeth, can you ask a question about Iran, perhaps?
Absolutely. Yes, I was going to ask, we know that Trump is infamously mercurial, but I was wondering if you feel that he will be able to continue to resist Pompeo and Bolton and their push to start a catastrophic war in the Gulf, as he did resist them a few weeks ago.
Well, I definitely believe that if Hillary Clinton had been president, we would have been at war maybe 2 years ago. I think Trump, no matter what one thinks of him, represents an agenda domestically, as well as his own idiosyncrasies, have consistently been against military intervention in the Middle East in particular. It has to be said, he was much more vocal against the war in Iraq than many in the Democratic Party, and even more than Bernie Sanders at the time early on. So I think that thus far he has proven to being able to impose its will in foreign policy. I mean, he went against his advisor with the meetings with North Korean leader. He went against his advisor in meeting with Putin more than once. And I think on the subject of war in the Middle East, that's something he seems to be strong about. However, he is so ignorant of the Middle East and he's so ignorant of international affairs that sometimes he exaggerates his ability to play brinkmanship. And I think the Iranian has proven, especially in the last few months, to be quite capable of pushing all the way in order to make it very clear that they are not going to accept the status quo and they are not going to be strangled economically without pushing back. And I think what they have done also to hit at the softest belly of the international imperialist power, and that is the clients of the United States in the Gulf region. And they have been very scared and terrified. And I find it very ironic that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which were the lobby of war along with Israel in Washington, D.C., have now changed their tune. And I noticed that UAE since have been packing its bags from Yemen suddenly after very heavy and brutal involvement there, because they are afraid and they know full well when the fires are shot, it will hit them first.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my second question, which was that the Qatar emir's offer to mediate between the US and Iran seemed to go nowhere during the emir's visit to Washington, D.C. last week. I wondered if that was your take on that visit and what you think that might hold going forward.
Well, again, it was such an absurd scene to see Trump bragging that the Qatari government is paying for the upkeep of American soldiers who are in Qatar. This is a show of what happened. The Qatari conflict, the Gulf conflict between Qatar on the one hand and UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other hand, has produced a competition between all these wealthy regimes to basically buy approval and sympathy from the Trump administration. And that has resulted in the transfer of billions of dollars of people's money in those countries. And of course, the people are not allowed to speak for themselves over there. And all that to keep Trump happy. And Trump is happy as long as they buy weapons and they accumulate them and they transfer their money to buy US Treasury bonds and so on. And that's what's happening. The other thing about mediation, I think that there are talks going on through the Omanis, through the Qataris, through the Japanese and so on. It is not what's happening in the surface. And I see many mixed messages. On Friday, Hassan Nasrallah said there is categorically no talks going to happen between Iran and the United States. 2 days later, I heard a very different message from the foreign minister of Iran and from the president of Iran, Rouhani. Both of them said there can be talks with the United States under one condition or two, which is to lift the sanctions or to go back to the agreement and so on. So there is more room for a possibility of talks than seems on the surface.
Interesting. No, that makes a lot of sense. Are there any hopes for accommodation between the Saudis and Iranians, which obviously would affect Yemen, Syria, etc.?
The Saudi government really now is an appendage of the Israeli government. There is a very strong alliance between the triangle, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. These are really, and of course, sponsored by the United States, these are the leaders of the Arab counter-revolution. They are the ones who smashed the revolutionary potential in Egypt, which Joe just alluded to, and they are now trying to do the same in Sudan. And in Sudan, the Communist Party, among some radical leftists, are warning about this counter-revolution, and for that, signing of the agreement with the military dictatorship has been delayed, despite pressure by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the United States.
Palestine also, has a Palestinian Authority president, obviously Mahmoud Abbas, and he's grown a spine. Has he grown a spine? During in turning down the bribe from the U.S., otherwise known as Trump's deal of the century. Do you think the Palestinians have ever let Abbas getting away with agreeing to that?
Mahmoud Abbas is not capable of growing a spine, even if his life depended on it. What seemed to be defiance in the face of the Trump administration is nothing but acceptance of reality. This guy is so unpopular. He is so discredited, and his corrupt regime and his family are so widely mocked and among the Palestinian Arab people that he realizes he doesn't have the ability to push any agreement, particularly one that goes against the minimum that Yasser Arafat championed throughout his life. It is partly his impotence and his weakness, and it is not his principled stance against the Trump administration.
When I obviously heard that when I was in Ramallah last time from cab drivers, he's universally despised, Abbas. There was a joke going around saying that the first words he spoke as a child was not mama, papa, but negotiations. Right. So he'll be there till he dies. Is that right, Assad? Is there any way to dislodge him?
Assuming he will die, but his life has been extended for too long. But all indications are for that. And I think the Israelis are more attached to him than anybody else. They realize that he is the one keeping the Palestinian Authority afloat, and they need it because despite all what we hear, the so-called security coordination, which is basically the establishment of a repressive regime over the Palestinians and the prevention of any resistance movement by them, is continued. It hasn't been interrupted, despite all the hostility and the wordage and the bombast. It has not been interrupted.
So what happens now with the Trump deal of the century is going to go nowhere, correct? And we'll just remain with the status quo. Continued.
This is the only Middle East package deal that has failed before it was even announced. There is absolutely no chance of it happening. I think it speaks to the arrogance and the conceit of Jared Kushner. this is somebody working with two individuals. The three of them never have any background in diplomacy or in Middle Eastern studies. The only thing that ties them to the Middle East is fanatic devotion to Israeli occupation. And they think that they can ram a solution against the Palestinians. I mean, it is so, I mean, how bad it has to be when even your Saudi client cannot support it. I mean, that's a sign of how far off what he proposed is from being accepted anywhere in the Arab world. I think for that reason, it will continue to be delayed. And I see it being delayed beyond the next term of Trump if he is reelected. And if there is another administration, it will be entirely forgotten, along with many other Middle East solutions that the U.S. proposed over the decades.
And that's just fine for Netanyahu and Israel, isn't it? Because they like the status quo. They like the illusion that there's diplomacy, but not real diplomacy.
They like the status quo, however, provided they can keep the Palestinian Authority afloat. In the case of a fall in the Palestinian Authority, which I think would be a welcome move if it happens, especially if, when Mahmoud Abbas dies and so on, and they are not able to resurrect any alternative. When that happens, then Israel would be more worried about that. And I think Israel also would like to distract its neighbors with blood and carnage, because to keep them away from it. That's why they would like to instigate conflict in Lebanon, and I see signs of that. They want to prolong the war in Syria. Israel has always invested. I mean, if you look at the history of the Middle East in my lifetime, I'm 59 years old, every civil war, every war in the Middle East, Israel has been a participant in it and always banking on the prolongation of that conflict. The Lebanese civil war, the Sudanese civil war, the Yemeni wars, this one and the one of the 1960s, the Northern Rebellion by the Kurds, everything. I mean, I cannot think of one conflict in which Israel was not heavily invested on the side of prolonging and always on the side of the most right-wing, least progressive forces in the region.
So that brings us back to what we said at the beginning. You don't see an early resolution to the Syrian war. Idlib province will, even if it falls to the Syrian army and the Russians, you're saying they're trying to revive a free Syrian army to cause trouble somewhere else, and the U.S. troops are not leaving Syria.
Right, but the chance of reviving the Free Syrian army is not viable at all. I mean, the record of that army has been farcical over the decades and so on. I mean, the only group that is effectively present in Idlib now are really the Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's what we should call them. I mean, they keep rebranding themselves, right, and the regime, and the Western media fall for it on purpose because they want to hide to the American reader the true reality of these groups. This is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and this is a group that the Obama administration has been quite fond of, and Ben Rhodes, who was advisor to Obama on the Middle East, in fact, admits in his book that he's championed not classifying Al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Qaeda, the group that was behind September 11, he did not want it to be branded as a terrorist group.
Asad AbuKhalil joined us from Modesto, California. He's a professor at California State University. And we were talking generally about the region and all of its many crises. And I thank you again, Asad, for coming on CN Live, and I hope you join us again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.